In theory, it was going to be a straightforward property conversion, a house near Willow Creek, Oregon, that needs some work but has a lot of potential and a breathtaking view. The idea of restoring ancient buildings had always been a goal of mine and my wife Delaney, and this particular property, which was a charming Victorian that was constructed in 1889, looked like the ideal undertaking. We even obtained it at a price that was lower than the market value, which, to look back on it, ought to have been the first warning sign. It was a subtle beginning to the uneasy sensation. There was a chilly breeze that stuck around even on the hottest days, and there was a subtle aroma of lavender that lingered in the air despite the fact that the home had been vacant for many years. It was attributed to peculiarities of the ancient dwelling. After then, the rumors started to circulate. I first became aware of it when we were in the process of removing wallpaper from the master bedroom. The sound was low and muttering, like if someone were chatting on the other side of the wall. My scraper was floating in midair as I came to a halt. "Delaney, did you hear that?" She gave a head shake while maintaining a look of bewilderment on her face. "Hear what, Wyatt?" As I strained my ears, I said, "A sound that is like a whisper." There was no longer any sound. It came from the wall. She laughed. "Delaney, you're putting in so much effort. It's most likely merely the wind's effect." In any case, it was not the wind. As time went on, the whispers became more frequent and clear. There were moments when they sounded like the voice of a lady, which was kind and melancholy. At other times, there were a cacophony of noises that we were unable to understand, seeming to be a chorus of voices that were just beyond our reach. When we were painting the living room one evening, a framed portrait of a young lady wearing a shirt with a high neckline fell off the mantel. The glass cracked, and the photograph fell to the ground in your face. It seemed as if the woman's eyes were following me as I picked it up, and there was a terrible intensity in their stare. There was a name scribbled in a fading pen on the reverse of the card, and it was Cordelia Blackwood. After that, we began looking into the history of the home. Cordelia Blackwood had been a resident of that location in the early 1900s, as it turned out. The circumstances surrounding her death were clouded in mystery, and she had passed away within the residence. The local legends said that there was a sad love affair, a spouse who was jealous, and a curse that was uttered. The whispers were harder to hear. Even when we were alone ourselves in the home, we began to experience the sound of our names being shouted out loud and clear. When objects moved, they did so on their own. The doors would go bang shut. In the middle of the night, I awoke to see Delaney sitting straight upright in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "Wyatt," she said, her voice shaking slightly as she spoke. "There's someone in the room." The light was switched on by me. The room was devoid of any occupants. However, there was a distinct feeling of dread that permeated the atmosphere. We were unable to remain there for much longer. As we packed our belongings, we left behind the renovations that were only partially completed and the terrible rumors that Cordelia Blackwood was spreading. In Willow Creek, the home is still standing, serving as a witness to a tale that we are unable to describe and a secret that is spoken inside its walls. There was no return for us. The second story. My grandfather, Theodore Teddy Caldwell, was a truck driver. He was a man of the road who was familiar with every bend and curve of Route 66, like it was the back of his hand. Although he had a million tales to tell, there was one that stayed with me forever. It was a story that he recounted with a shiver in his voice, even when he was in the blazing heat of Arizona. When he recalled it, his eyes were far away, and he would state that it was the summer of 1972. He was traveling from California to Chicago with a shipment of oranges, and he was traveling through the barren part of Route 66 that was located close to Oatman, Arizona. When he happened to see her, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky above the desert in shades of orange and purple. A young lady who was standing by the side of the road with her thumb extended wearing a flowery dress and a denim jacket that had fallen out of style. She seemed to be fragile and lost. Being the nice and kind person that he was, Teddy pulled over. As she hopped into the taxi, the young lady's eyes were set downward. Her only response was a grateful nod, and she did not speak. When Teddy asked her where she was going, she just pointed farther down the road, in the direction of a little village that was completely abandoned and that he had never heard of before. He dismissed it with a shrug, assuming that she was more familiar with the route than he was with these areas. Both the rumbling of the engine and the odd howl of a coyote in the distance were the only sounds that could be heard throughout the period of time that they were driving in quiet. After then, Teddy crossed his gaze to the young lady. She was no longer present, simply vanished into thin air. Despite the fact that his heart was beating in his chest, he slammed on the brakes. He looked beneath the vehicle, into the rear of the cab, and even examined the back of the cab. None of it. While he was driving, he continued to be shaken, his thoughts racing. He arrived to the settlement that the girl had indicated, which consisted of a collection of run-down houses with windows that were boarded up. He made a pit stop at the one and only gas station, which was a filthy, run-down establishment that seemed to have not been visited by a customer in years. He related the story of the hitchhiker to the elderly guy who was working behind the counter, explaining how she had vanished. Although his eyes were squinted, the elderly guy listened with patience. A dry laugh came out of Teddy's mouth after he had done. "That's Amelia," he remarked with a ragged tone in his voice. "For years, she's been hitchhiking along that particular stretch of road, trying to find her way back home." Ted inquired as to what he meant by it. "Just shaking his head," the elderly guy said. "It was back in the 1950s when Amelia passed away on that route. It was a car accident. It is said that her soul continues to roam, endlessly searching for a ride to a destination that she will never arrive at." This was the last time that Teddy ever picked up another hitchhiker. During his lengthy and solitary rides, he believed that he could still feel the weight of Amelia's ghostly presence beside him, acting as a silent passenger. And every time he drove by that section of Route 66, he would slowly slow down, half expecting to see her standing there with her thumb extended, eternally lost on the route of forgotten souls. The third story. Georgia's Savannah was home to my great-aunt Mathilde, who resided in a vast mansion designed in the Gothic style. A home that was packed with old furniture, dusty paintings, and an aura of fading grandeur. It was a lovely location, yet one that had a very frightening atmosphere. The home was handed down to my family when she died away, and as the eldest grandson, I was given the responsibility of cleaning it out. Last but not least, I worked my way up to the attic. It was a big, dark room that was stuffed with dust, tapestries that had been devoured by moths, and valuables that had been forgotten. There was a whiff of cedar in the air, and the air was heavy with dust. During the process of sorting through boxes of old pictures and letters that had turned yellow, I began to experience a presence and a feeling of being watched. When I initially heard it, I thought it was just my imagination. Nevertheless, the sensation became more intense and persistent. There were transient shadows that darted beneath stacks of boxes, and I would catch glimpses of movement in the fringe of my eyesight. It seemed as if the temperature in the attic dropped by several degrees, which was a quite cold contrast to the humid air in Savannah. I was looking at a dusty trunk one day when I heard a definite scratching sound coming from the far corner of the attic. I was able to locate the source of the sound. My heart was racing in my chest as I could not move. The scratching continued, seeming to be slow and methodical, similar to the way fingernails drag over wood. When I got to the corner, I approached it with caution, and as I reached for the light switch, my hand was shaking. The window, which was boarded up and tiny, was illuminated by the flickering light of the bare bulb. Not a single scratch was heard. I took a careful look at the window itself. Despite the fact that the boards were old and twisted, there were no obvious indications that anything was attempting to enter. One of my attempts was to justify it. It's possible that it was a rat or a squirrel. A part of me, however, was aware that it was something different. There is something more ominous. I was unable to go to sleep that night. My thoughts kept going back to the sound of scratching. A transient shadow appeared in the corner of my eye, and I couldn't stop seeing it. When I was finally able to get out of bed, I walked back up to the attic and brought a flashlight with me. In the darkness, the attic seemed much more unnerving than it already was. It seemed as if the shadows were writhing and twisting, then taking on hideous forms. As I approached the corner where I had heard the scratching, I flashed my spotlight into the area. That is when I was able to see it. My spotlight illuminated the eyes of a shadowy humanoid entity that was crouching in the darkness. The eyes of the figure were burning red. It remained still and just gazed at me, its eyes filled with a malicious intent. I let out a yell, dropped the torch and fell backwards, my panicked thoughts racing through my head. Never again did I come upon the figure. During that night, I ran away from the home, and I never came back. Even though the home is still in the family, no one has ever lived there again since it was built. While the attic continues to be sealed, its secrets are concealed in the shadows, and the sinister entity that dwells inside it continues to protect them. The fourth story. Rosalind, my cousin, was always a free spirit who enjoyed exploration and the wide road. She was a lover of adventure. Between San Francisco and Los Angeles, she made the decision to go on a journey by herself via Highway 1, which is part of the Pacific Coast Highway. The wild coastline, the roaring waves, and the feeling of freedom that came with being on the open road were all things that she cherished. Her journey to Los Angeles was never completed. One evening, she contacted me from a little hotel in Big Sur, where she was staying. Her tone was strained, and it was laced with a worry that I had never previously heard in her voice. When I asked her about it, she related a peculiar experience that she had earlier that day. When she observed a person standing by the side of the road, she was traveling along a particularly barren section of roadway, which also included cliffs that dropped precipitously into the ocean below. The guy was wearing a black suit, and he was wearing a hat with a broad brim that hid his face. At first glance, it seemed as if he had materialized out of thin air, as if he had emerged from the mist that clung to the shore. With the possibility that he need assistance, Rosalind slowed down. However, as she grew closer to him, she became aware of something that was peculiar about him. He was not interested in her at all. His whole body was perfectly motionless as he gazed out at the ocean through his eyes. The shudder that ran down her spine was accompanied by her driving past him. When she looked in her rearview mirror, she saw that he had disappeared. In the same instant that he had come, he vanished. She ran across him once again, a few miles farther down the road, maintaining the same position, looking out at the sea in front of them. When she did it again, she did not slow down. Despite the fact that her heart was beating in her chest, she slammed her foot down on the gas pedal. She saw him a number of times during the day, and each time he was in the same location, gazing out at the ocean on each occasion. She increased her speed with each sighting, her terror increasing with each passing moment. As she spoke over the phone, her voice was shaking as she murmured, "It's almost as if he's right behind me." However, he is constantly existing and waiting. There is a feeling that he is haunting the roadway. I made an effort to soothe her by telling her that it was most likely simply her imagination running wild. Nevertheless, I was able to pick up on the anxiety in her voice, and I was aware that something was wrong. At that point, I had finished my conversation with Rosalind. After a few days had passed, her vehicle was discovered abandoned, parked in a perilous position near to the brink of a cliff. Nobody could find any trace of her. After many weeks of searching, the authorities were unable to locate her corpse. Some people believe that Highway 1 is still haunted by the guy in the black suit, who is said to be a spirit protector of the lost souls who disappeared along its serpentine bends. On occasion, cars have reported seeing him standing by the side of the road on foggy evenings. His face was disguised by his hat, and he seemed to be continually looking out at the cruel ocean that surrounded him. The fifth story. Blackwood Manor was a large home that was in the process of deteriorating and was surrounded in an aura of mystery and sorrow. It was situated on a hill that overlooked the town of Blackwood, Pennsylvania. A number of decades had passed since it had been abandoned, with its windows boarded up and its grounds covered with weeds. The Blackwood family, their terrible past, and the curse that was said to haunt the house were legends that were passed down from generation to generation by the locals. As the thrill-seeking youngsters that we were, my friends and I arrived with the conclusion that we should investigate it. It was a cool evening in the fall, and the air was dense with the smell of leaves that had fallen to the ground. Our pulses were pumping with a combination of excitement and trepidation as we approached the mansion on foot. We parked our vehicle further down the road and then approached it manually. Despite the fact that the wrought iron gates had been rusted shut, we were able to access the area via a breach in the bars. The only sound that could be heard was the crunch of leaves under our boots, which was strangely quiet on the grounds. In front of us, the house loomed, its black windows seeming to be empty eyes that were peering into our very souls. After discovering a side entrance that was unlocked, we carefully entered the building. The air within was thick with the odor of dust and decay, and it was heavy and stale. The moonlight that was coming in through the dirty windows cast a dull light on the entryway of the stately building. The magnificent chandeliers were adorned with cobwebs that hung from them like grotesque ornaments. An indistinct rustling sound could be heard coming from somewhere inside the walls. During the course of our exploration of the mansion, the mood became more uncomfortable. We discovered a library that was stuffed with old volumes that were bound in leather and had pages that were yellowed and fragile. A huge ballroom that has a dead piano and a dance floor that is in a state of disrepair. In the dining room, there was a large table that was empty, and it was set up for a feast that would never be consumed. A photograph of a beautiful lady dressed in a long flowing robe was discovered in the master bedroom. The image had become faded. As we went around the room, it seemed as if her eyes were following us. A journal was placed on a tiny table underneath the photograph that was there. Despite the shaking in our hands, we opened it. Eleanor Blackwood, the last person to live at the mansion, was considered to be the owner of the journal. In her writing, she described eerie happenings, such as whispering in the night and a shadowy figure that wandered the corridors of the building. A rising sense of dread, as well as the sensation that she was not alone in the home, was something that she wrote about. A shudder ran down our spines as we read the last entry, which said, "The shadows are closing in. I can hear them muttering my name in a low voice, fearing that I would not make it through the night." Despite the fact that our hearts were racing in our chests, we slammed the journal shut. There was no way for us to stay there. While we were about to go, we heard a low growl that had a guttural quality coming from the corridor. It seemed as if our blood had become ice cold. It was a race. Not until we were back in the vehicle, which was a considerable distance away from Blackwood Manor, did we finally stop running. Because the memories was too horrific to revisit, we never again told anybody about what had happened to us. Blackwood Manor is still standing on that hill, serving as a memorial to the horrible end that befell the Blackwood family and the rumors that continue to haunt the crumbling walls of the manor. The sixth story. In addition to being a beautiful and historically significant city, St. Augustine, Florida, is also home to a number of sinister mysteries. My grandmother, Evangeline, was born and raised in that location, and she shared with me a tale that has remained with me throughout my life. It is a tale about the spectral light that is said to haunt the gates of the ancient city. As a reminder of St. Augustine's colonial heritage, the city gates, which were constructed in the 18th century, are a well-known landmark in the city. The local mythology, on the other hand, asserts that they are also haunted by the soul of a young lady called Maria. Maria was anticipating the homecoming of her husband from the war, who was serving in the military. Every night she would wait by the city gates with a lamp in her hand, with the expectation that she would be able to get a glimpse of his ship entering the harbor. Nevertheless, her spouse never came back. Maria, who was beyond sad, finally passed away from her sorrow after he was lost at sea. Some people believe that her presence continues to haunt the city gates, where her lamp may be seen flickering in the darkness. It is a symbol of hope for a love that was taken from her much too soon. In her own words, my grandma said that she had saw the light. She said that she was going home late one night when she saw a dim light that flickered and emanated from the city gates. The figure of a lady wearing a long white dress and carrying a lamp became visible to her as she moved closer to the scene. The lady turned her face towards her, appearing with a pale and ghostly appearance, and then disappeared into thin air. I, of course, had a dubious attitude. However, when I was in St. Augustine, I made the decision to go through the experience for myself. I made my way to the city gates on foot, the ancient pathways lined with cobblestones illuminated by the moonlight. With their black arches throwing lengthy shadows, the gates stood in silence and assumed an intimidating presence. I was standing there when I saw it. The gates were illuminated by a dim light that flickered and emanated from inside. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest. As I approached mindfully, my gaze remained locked on the radiant light. The brightness and clarity of it increased. Later on, I came upon her. With a light in their hand, a person dressed in a long white frock. Despite the fact that her face was concealed by the darkness, she stayed still. With my head swirling in astonishment, I wanted to flee, but I was unable to move from where I was standing. The figure turned towards me, the lantern shining light on her face as she passed by. She had a pale and haggard appearance, and her eyes were empty and filled with an indescribable despair. Once she had finished staring at me for a little period of time, she disappeared just as suddenly as she had come. I was left standing alone in the darkness, with my pulse racing in my chest, when the light suddenly vanished all around me. My grandmother's account was never anything I questioned again. It is true that the spectral light that emanates from St. Augustine is a manifestation of a love that has been lost and a soul that is still looking for its way back home. The seventh story. It was a place of whispers and shadows, a monument to lost lives and horrific tragedies, and it was located deep inside the forests of Vermont. Cedar Hill Asylum was a haven of quiet and solitude. It had been deserted for a considerable amount of time, and the crumbling walls and damaged windows were a witness to its troubled history. Thaddeus, my brother, and I made the decision to investigate it because we were captivated by the appeal of the unknown. The day that we arrived to Cedar Hill was rather chilly and cloudy. In addition to the dense fog that lingered in the air, the sky was cloudy, which contributed to the institution having an even more ominous aspect. In addition to the grounds being covered with weeds and prickly shrubs, the gates made of wrought iron were rusty and squeaking. With our pulses pumping with a combination of excitement and anxiety, we entered the institution via a window that had been shattered from the inside. The air inside was thick with the scent of mildew and rot, and it was heavy and stagnant as you entered. It was difficult to see through the walls, and the floors were covered with shards of glass and other kinds of debris. We went around the institution room by room, and each one I found to be more unsettling than the one before it. Padded cells with rusted shackles, Operating rooms with soiled surgical tables and patient rooms with vacant beds and deteriorating mattresses were among the things that we discovered, among other things. The only sounds that could be heard were the creaking of the floors under our feet and the odd trickle of water from the ceiling that was leaking. We discovered an old medical record stack in one of the patient rooms that we were working in. Our stomachs were in knots as we read through them, and the descriptions of the procedures that were carried out behind those walls made our stomachs turn. Lobotomies, electroshock treatment, and experimental medications are all examples. A disturbing reminder of the atrocities that had occurred inside those walls. It was a reminder that was terrifying. As our exploration of the facility progressed, we started to become aware of a presence and a feeling that we were being observed. Occasionally, we would get a glimpse of movement at the fringe of our eyesight, and shadows would dart over the walls behind us. It seemed as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees, and the atmosphere became thick with a distinct feeling of dread. A massive metal door with a strong padlock was located in the basement, where we discovered it. With some effort, we were able to force it open, which revealed a dark and narrow stairway that led down into the unknown. Even though our hearts were racing in our chests, we hesitated. If we go down, should we? The want to learn more won out over us. As we made our way down the steps, our flashlights were able to illuminate the darkness clearly. The temperature of the air dropped, and the odor of decay became more intense. When we reached the bottom of the steps, we found ourselves in a lengthy hallway that was only barely illuminated. Each of the tiny barred cages that lined the walls included a bucket and a rusted cot. The walls were lined with small cells. We heard a deep, guttural groan coming from one of the cells as we were walking down the hallway leading to the second floor. As our blood began to run cold, we came to a standstill. The groaning became more louder and more forceful. For the first time, we were able to see the cell after shining our spotlights inside of it. Our spotlights illuminated the eyes of a skeleton person that was hunched in the corner of the room. The eyes were burning red. In an attempt to get closer to us, it extended its skeletal fingers and grabbed at the air. Fear whirled through our heads as we yelled and turned to flee from the situation. Not until we were out of the facility and back in the vehicle, which was a considerable distance away from Cedar Hill, did we finally stop running. Because the memories was too horrific to revisit, we never again told anybody about what had happened to us. Those woods are still home to the deteriorating Cedar Hill Asylum, which serves as a testament to the atrocities that occurred in the past and the tortured souls who continue to roam its passageways. Story 8. The St. Michael's Church in Maine, which was situated on a cliff overlooking the stormy Atlantic Ocean, was a haven of serene seclusion and a refuge for souls that were becoming weary. On the other hand, it was also shrouded in a dark mystery, a tale that was passed down from generation to generation about the ghostly bells that rang out on stormy nights. I was given the tale of the phantom bells by my mother, Serafina, who grew up in the little fishing hamlet that was tucked at the foot of the cliff. Her voice was hushed with respect and horror as she told me the story. The bells, according to her, belonged to a ship that had sunk on the rocks under the cathedral many decades before. A fierce storm had grabbed the ship, which was carrying riches and spices, and it had slammed into the rocky rocks to make an emergency landing. Their pleas were drowned out by the storming wave, and all crew withdrew from the vessel. It was said by the villagers that on stormy nights you could hear the phantom bells of the ship ringing out over the ocean, a melancholy cry for the souls who had been lost. They said that it was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the magnitude of the ocean's force and the precarious nature of human existence. However, despite the fact that I found the narrative to be fascinating, I chose to disregard it as folklore, a result of superstition and hyperactive imaginations, up to the point when I heard the bells personally on a rainy night. During my visit to my mother and I were sitting by the fire, listening to the wind scream outside, when we heard it. a ringing sound that was faint and far away, borne by the wind. This melancholy and frightening sound that sent chills down my spine got louder and more clear until it filled the air. It was a sound that filled the air. The complexion of my mother became pallid. "The bells," she said, her eyes widening in terror as she spoke. "The phantom bells." In a hurry, we made our way to the window and peered out into the dark, stormy night. Both the rain and the waves were slamming against the cliffs below, and the wind was whipping the rain against the glass. Moreover, despite the storm, we were able to hear the bells resonating over the ocean, and they were as clear as the sun. I had never heard anything quite like that before. That was really unique. The atmosphere was gloomy, eerie, and imbued with an indescribable sense of melancholy. It was the sound of spirits that had disintegrated and were wailing from the depths of the ocean. After a period of time that felt like an eternity, the bells finally came to a halt, just as abruptly as they had started making their sound. What followed was a deafening quiet, with the only sounds that could be heard being the roaring wind and the smashing waves. The tale of the phantom bells was never anything that I questioned again. They are a reminder of the strength of the water and the continuing spirit of those who were lost at sea. And they are a tribute to the tragedy that took place on those rocks hundreds of years ago. Story 9. Echo Ridge Sanatorium, which was located in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, was a site that had lost its magnificence and was filled with terrifying whispers over the years. It remained as a harsh reminder of a bygone period, a time when mental illness was veiled in mystery and terror. It had been abandoned for decades, and it stood as a strong reminder of that past. Calliope, a friend of mine, and I made the decision to investigate after being captivated by the appeal of deserted locations. The air was dense with the aroma of pine and moist dirt as we arrived to Echo Ridge, which was late in the afternoon and covered in fog. Standing in front of us was the sanatorium, which had a spectral effect due to its grey stone walls and windows that were completely vacant. The wrought iron gates had been rusted shut, and the grounds were covered with weeds that had grown out of control. After discovering a side entrance that was unlocked, we carefully entered the building. The air within was thick with the odor of dust and decay, and it was heavy and stale. It was difficult to see through the walls, and the floors were covered with shards of glass and other kinds of debris. The only sounds that could be heard were the creaking of the floors under our feet and the odd trickle of water from the ceiling that was leaking. Step by step, we went into the sanatorium, each room being more unsettling than the one that came before it. We discovered examination rooms that had rusted medical tools, patient rooms that included vacant beds and mattresses that were deteriorating, and a hydrotherapy area that contained a huge tub that was empty. There was a strong feeling of melancholy and hopelessness in the air, which made the environment suffocating. There was a diary that we discovered in one of the patient rooms. It belonged to a young lady by the name of Elara, who had been a patient in the past. Through her writing, she detailed her experiences at Echo Ridge, including the terrible abuse she was subjected to and the unusual events she personally experienced. It was in her writing that she described hearing whispers in the night, seeing shadows moving about in the corners of her room, and having the sensation that she was being watched all the time. The more we read Elara's diary, the more we were aware of a presence, a feeling that we were being observed. Occasionally, we would get a glimpse of movement at the fringe of our eyesight, and shadows would dart over the walls behind us. It seemed as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees, and the atmosphere became thick with a distinct feeling of dread. A massive metal door with a strong padlock was located in the basement, where we discovered it. Eventually, we were successful in breaking the lock and opening the door, which revealed a dark and narrow stairway that led down into the unknown direction. Even though our hearts were racing in our chests, we hesitated. If we go down, should we? The want to learn more won out over us. As we made our way down the steps, our flashlights were able to illuminate the darkness clearly. The temperature of the air dropped, and the odor of decay became more intense. When we reached the bottom of the steps, we found ourselves in a lengthy hallway that was only barely illuminated. Each of the tiny barred cages that lined the walls included a bucket and a rusted cot. The walls were lined with small cells. During our journey down the hallway, we were able to hear a scream that was so terrifying that it came from one of the cells. As our blood began to run cold, we came to a standstill. When we shined our spotlights inside the cell, that is when we had the opportunity to see her. The apparition was spectral, dressed in a medical gown, with a pale and haggard face and large eyes that were filled with fear. Her ethereal fingers grasped at the air as she extended her hand towards us as she stretched out. Fear whirled through our heads as we yelled and turned to flee from the situation. Not until we were out of the sanatorium and back in the vehicle, which was a considerable distance away from Echo Ridge, did we finally stop running. Because the memories was too horrific to revisit, we never again told anybody about what had happened to us. Echo Ridge Sanatorium is still standing in those mountains. It is a memorial to the atrocities that occurred in the past and the tortured souls who continue to walk the hallways of the deteriorating facility. 10th story. A place where life flowed at a slower pace and neighbors knew each other by name. Whisper Creek was a little town that was situated in the rolling hills of Kentucky. It was an exquisite location. In spite of this, there was a dark secret that lurked under the surface of this tranquil neighborhood. It was a tale that was passed about among the residents of Whisper Creek concerning the children who disappeared. The narrative was related to me by my uncle Jasper, who had spent his childhood near Whisper Creek. His voice was hushed with respect and horror as he told me the story. The disappearance of a small child called Finley, according to him, was the beginning of whatever happened. During the time when Finley was playing in the woods next to his house, he disappeared without a trace. There were several searches carried out, but no trace of him was ever discovered. After that, a few months later, still another youngster vanished without a trace. Someone who goes by the name Willow. The last time anybody saw her, she was playing in the fields next to the stream. Once again, searches were carried out, but there was never any evidence of her being located. The disappearances began to occur one after the other, with each one being more puzzling than the one that came before it. The children of Whisper Creek were disappearing, consumed by the soil, and the only thing that they left behind was a path of unanswered questions and families who were shattered to their core. The citizens of the village gossiped about a curse, a malicious thing that was said to be hiding in the woods and preying on those who were not guilty. They reported seeing weird lights in the night, hearing whispers borne by the wind, and having the impression that they were being watched all the time. In his own words, my uncle said that he had seen something. It was late at night while he was going home when he observed a person standing by the stream. He added, "It was tall and thin, but the darkness masked its features. It was dressed in black. It seemed as if it was observing him, its stare being icy and penetrating. His pulse was thumping in his chest as he raced, and he never turned around to look behind. It was finally determined that the disappearances had ceased, but the mystery continued. A sobering reminder of the evil that may lie under the surface of even the most ideal towns is the fact that the children of Whisper Creek were never recovered. Their fate is a haunting reminder of its existence. Whisper Creek is a community that will long be plagued by the memories of the children who went missing, and it still carries the wounds of its sad history on its face. The 11th story. Although it was a short and winding road that snaked through the lush woods of Washington State, Hemlock Lane was a location of disturbing beauty. It was a place where the shadows appeared to stay longer than they should have. One misty evening, my friend Aurelia and I made the decision to go for a trip down Hemlock Lane. We were lured to the appeal of the unknown, and we decided to take a drive. As we proceeded farther into the forest, the fog became more dense, and it began to swirl around the vehicle as if it were a scene from a ghost story. We were surrounded by towering trees, the branches of which were twisted and gnarled, and the leaves of which rustled dangerously in the wind. A real sensation of dread began to permeate the atmosphere, making everything heavier. Aurelia breathed a sigh of surprise. A hushed, "Look," she said as she pointed to the side of the road. I was able to see it by following her eyes. There is a tall, shadowy person that is standing under a hemlock tree that is quite tall. However, we were able to make out its long, thin limbs and its piercing red eyes, despite the fact that its features were covered by the fog. The rapid beating of our hearts in our chests caused us to slow down. This creature did not move. It just remained there, staring at us with a chilly and nasty expression on its face. While our brains were racing with fear, we slammed our foot down on the gas pedal and sped past the man approaching us. However, when we looked in the rearview mirror, the person was no longer visible. In the same instant that it had emerged, it vanished. We traveled in silence for a time, our nerves strained and our brains racing as we went through the ride. We made an effort to make sense of what we had seen. It may have been a hiker. It could have also been a trick of the fog. But we were aware on some level that it was something more. There is something more ominous. The second time we noticed it was as we were getting closer to a steep curve in the road. We were unable to proceed because of the shadow figure that was standing in the center of the road with its arms extended beyond its body. The automobile came to a stop only a few inches away from the figure after we stomped on the brakes with all of our might. In that moment, it remained there, immobile, its fiery eyes penetrating our very souls. We yelled, and the sound of our voices reverberated across the still forest. Following that, the figure disappeared in the same instant that it had emerged. Despite the fact that our hearts were hammering in our chests, we managed to reverse the vehicle and speed away from Hemlock Lane. Because the memories was too horrific to revisit, we never again told anybody about what had happened to us. As time goes on, Hemlock Lane continues to be a place of enigma and terror, a place where the shadows conceal a sinister mystery. The 12th story. There are some dark mysteries that are hidden inside Redwood National Park, which is a region that is known for its beautiful beauty and its ancient trees. During one of the summers, my sister Indira and I were camping in the park when we came upon something that we were unable to explain, and that continues to haunt our nightmares. In the vicinity of a lonely grove of redwood trees, we had put up our tent, and the air was dense with the aroma of pine and the smell of moist soil. As night struck, a dense fog began to sweep in, which resulted in the woodland being enveloped in a spooky quiet. We were engaging in activities such as telling tales and toasting marshmallows around the campfire when we became aware of it. There was a soft murmur that was borne by the breeze. It seemed to be emanating from the depths of the forest, urging us to come closer to discover what it was. Our eyes met with apprehensive stares. "Did you hear that?" Indira said in a hushed whisper, her voice shaking. With my pulse hammering in my chest, I gave a little nod. It sounded like someone whispering, I explained to myself. The whisper became much louder and more forceful. We were being called by a voice that sounded like that of a lady, one that was kind and sorrowful. With our pulses racing in our chests, we carefully ventured into the jungle, while grabbing our flashlights and carrying them with us. The fog was dense, and it enveloped us like spectral apparitions as it swirled about us. The enormous trunks of the redwood trees seemed to vanish into the mist that was above us as they towered above us. We proceeded to be led farther into the woodland by the whispering that persisted. After following the sound, our flashlights were able to cut through the darkness until we arrived at a tiny clearing. The lady, who was dressed in a long white garment, was standing in the middle of the clearing. Her face was pale and haggard, and her eyes were empty and filled with an indescribable grief. Her voice was low and sorrowful as she beckoned us to come closer to her because she was whispering. It seemed as if our blood had become ice cold. We were unable to move because of the terror that we were experiencing. While she continued to whisper, the woman's voice became more louder and more forceful. Her ethereal fingers grasped at the air as she extended her hand towards us as she stretched out. Fear whirled through our heads as we yelled and turned to flee from the situation. When we finally arrived at our tent, our hearts were beating so hard that we didn't stop running until we reached it. While we were leaving the park, our thoughts were flooded with the cold recollection of the lady who was muttering. We gathered up our belongings and ran away. Since the memories of our visit to Redwood National Park was too scary to revisit, we never went back there. A ghostly entity that lingers in the old redwood forest, the whispering lady continues to be a mystery. The 13th story. Devil's Gulch was a deep and narrow canyon that was cut into the mountains of Colorado. It was a place of forlorn beauty, a place where the echoes of the past appeared to linger in the air. My grandpa, Theron, who was a former railroad engineer, told me a tale about Devil's Gulch that has always resonated with me. It is a story about the ghost train that is said to haunt the canyon. According to him, the train was a passenger train that had become wrecked in Devil's Gulch around the beginning of the 19th century. It was a rock slide that caused the train to crash into the canyon below, resulting in the deaths of all those who were on board. Their corpses were never found, and their spirits remained ensnared deep inside the twisted debris for all of eternity. According to the villagers, on nights when there was no moon, you could hear the ghost train rumbling down the canyon. The whistle of the train would reverberate through the mountains, sounding like a melancholy cry for the souls that had been lost. They said that it was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the perils that were waiting to be discovered in those mountains. I, of course, had a dubious attitude. On the other hand, I was camping in Devil's Gulch with several buddies when I heard the train for the first time for myself. We were engaging in activities such as telling tales and toasting marshmallows around the campfire when we became aware of it. An indistinct roar that reverberates across the canyon. As the sound of a train approached, it became more audible and clear, eventually filling the air with its presence. Our eyes met with apprehensive stares. During the conversation, my buddy Zephyr murmured, "Did you hear that?" in a frightened voice. With my pulse hammering in my chest, I gave a little nod. "It sounds like a train," I responded. "I know why." A closer and stronger sound could be heard. The engine was making a steady chugging sound, and the wheels were screaming on the rails. We were able to hear both of these sounds. Then, we were able to see it. A phantom train appeared from the darkness, its lights flashing in an eerie manner. Its spectral shape went softly through the canyon as it moved through the canyon. The dark silhouettes of the passengers could be seen in the windows. Their features were pale and haggard, and their eyes were looking blankly front of them. Fear had us completely immobilized, and our heads were spinning with incredulity. Following its passing, the train disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a spectral whistle that reverberated across the canyon. While our hearts were racing in our chests, we gathered our belongings and made our escape from Devil's Gulch. Because the memories was too horrific to revisit, we never again told anybody about what had happened to us. There is still a lot of mystery about the phantom train of Devil's Gulch, which serves as a spectral reminder of the tragedy that took place in those mountains so long ago. The 14th story. Both the weather and the currents along the Cape Fear shoreline in North Carolina are notoriously unpredictable, making it a particularly hazardous stretch of coastline. It is also the location of a lighthouse that is claimed to be haunted, and it is thought that the souls of sailors who went missing walk the area. The tale that my cousin Thisbe, who works as a park ranger at Cape Fear, told me about the lighthouse was so terrifying that it sent shivers down my spine. Her statement was that the lighthouse, which was constructed in the 1800s, served as a beacon of hope for ships that were traversing the hazardous seas. However, over the course of hundreds of years, a great number of ships had sunk on the rocks below, and their crews had been lost to the harsh sea. During stormy nights, it was thought that their melancholy screams could be heard reverberating through the tower of the lighthouse, as their souls had found shelter there. It was Thisbe who had personally heard the screams. She said that she was now working the night shift at the lighthouse when she became aware of a faint weeping sound emanating from the highest point of the tower. Despite the fact that her heart was hammering in her chest, she made her way up the twisting stairs and arrived at the lantern chamber. There was no one in the room, but the wailing persisted, and it was gentle and melancholy, like the tears of a child who had been lost. In the midst of the stormy darkness, Thisbe gazed out the window and observed the scene. At that moment, she was able to see them. The phantom arms of the spectral beings were stretching out towards the lighthouse. Their features were pale and haggard, and their eyes were empty and filled with anguish. They were clutching to the rocks below. It turned out that these were the souls of the sailors who had gone missing, and their spirits were permanently ensnared in the perilous seas of Cape Fear. Thisbe let out a scream and went backwards, her thoughts swirling in fear as she stood there. Suddenly, the figures disappeared, and their shouts were drowned out by the rumble of the storm. During that night, she ran away from the lighthouse, and she never came back, in spite of the fact that it is a site of mystery and danger. The Cape Danger Lighthouse continues to be a beacon of hope for those who are still alive, and a phantom shelter for those who have lost their souls at sea. The 15th story. There was a spot in the Cascade Range of Oregon known as Shadow Mountain that was a distant mountain that was characterized by its rugged beauty and disturbing stillness. In addition to that, it was the location of a cabin that was said to be cursed, a spot where misfortune had occurred on several occasions, leaving behind a legacy of terror and misery. I was given the tale of the cursed cabin by my uncle Oberon, who is an enthusiastic outdoorsman and hiker. His voice was hushed with respect and horror as he told me the story. There was a prospector by the name of Jedediah who, according to him, constructed the cabin in the early 1900s. The cabin was constructed by Jedediah when he discovered gold on Shadow Mountain. He intended to use it as a location to escape the severe winters and keep his riches. But Jedediah's good fortune did not last long. His corpse was found some months later, clutching a handful of gold nuggets. He had been trapped inside the cabin by a snowstorm, to which he succumbed to the effects of freezing. Other misfortunes befell those who had the audacity to remain in the cabin throughout the course of the years. Unfortunate fatalities occurred among the hikers who sought refuge in the cabin after becoming disoriented in the forest. In a mystery fire, a family that had sought shelter from the storm was tragically killed. Jedediah's malevolent ghost was said to be defending his riches and punishing anybody who trespassed on his property, according to the unspoken rumors that circulated among the people. Oberon was the one who had personally experienced the curse. After hiking to Shadow Mountain with a group of pals, he made the decision to spend the night at the cabin that was located there. As the night wore on, they were overcome with a peculiar sense of discomfort. The temperature fell considerably, and the wind howled outside, causing the windows to rattle and shaking the cabin to its very foundations. It was during the night that they heard weird sounds, such as footsteps squeaking on the floors and voices reverberating through the rooms that were vacant. As a means of rationalizing the situation, they attempted to attribute it to the wind and their hyperactive imaginations. They were aware, however, that something was amiss with them. In the middle of the night, a young lady by the name of Lyra, who was one of Oberon's acquaintances, let out a painful scream. As they went to her side, they saw that she was shaking and that her eyes were wide with fear. The The woman said that she had saw a shadowy apparition looming above her, a person with burning red eyes and a skeleton hand reaching out to grasp her. They looked through the cabin, but they did not find anything. Although they made an effort to calm Lyra down, she was unable to be consoled since she was certain that Jedediah's spirit was following them about. As the sun began to rise, they made the decision to depart from the cabin. After stepping outdoors, they were able to see it. There were 3 phrases written in a scratchy manner on the wooden door of the cabin: "Get out now." Despite the fact that their hearts were racing in their chests, they departed Shadow Mountain. Because the recollection was too horrific for them to recall, they never again discussed what had happened to them. The furious ghost that continues to protect the secrets of the cursed cabin on Shadow Mountain is a tribute to the horrors that have transpired inside its walls. The cabin continues to be a place of mystery and terror. The 16th story. The barren stretch of shoreline in Massachusetts known as Widow's Hill was a spot that was both hauntingly beautiful and tragically connected to the past. In honor of Ilara, a young lady whose husband, a fisherman, went missing at sea, the land was given the name Ilara. Ilara would make her way to the top of the hill on a daily basis, in the expectation of catching a view of the ship that her husband was sailing back to port. He did not come back, however. Ilara, who was overtaken with sadness, pushed herself from the cliffs on a stormy night, and her corpse was sucked up by the harsh sea. Ilara's melancholy screams were said to reverberate through the fog on stormy nights, according to the locals, who whispered that Ilara's soul still resided atop Widow's Hill. Her ethereal apparition was claimed to be perpetually roving the cliffs, a beacon of hopelessness and unrequited love, according to those who said she was looking for her husband who had gone missing. The tale of Ilara was recounted to me by my grandmother, Isadora, who grew up in the vicinity of Widow's Hill. Her voice was hushed with respect and horror as she told me the story. Her assertion was that she had personally seen Ilara's spirit. She said that she was strolling down the beach on a cloudy evening when she saw a person standing on top of Widow's Hill. Someone was wearing a long white dress, and her hair was blowing in the breeze. It was a lady. Her face was pale and haggard, and her eyes were filled with an indescribable grief. She was looking out at the ocean. When my grandmother saw the apparition, she immediately knew her as Ilara, the spectral widow of Widow's Hill. As she saw Ilara lift her arms toward the heavens and let out a sad scream, her voice reverberated through the fog. She was filled with both amazement and horror simultaneously. After then, she abruptly disappeared into thin air, just as fast as she had arrived. I, of course, had a dubious attitude. On the other hand, I made the decision to see for myself on a cloudy evening when I was visiting my grandma. As I made my way to Widow's Hill, the wind whipped the fog about me, and the waves smashed against the rocks below me. I was able to see her when I climbed to the peak of the hill. There was a person who seemed to be standing at the brink of the cliff, wearing a long white dress, with her hair flowing in the breeze. Her face was pale and haggard, and her eyes were filled with an indescribable grief. She was looking out at the ocean, and it was Ilara. At the same time as my heart was beating in my chest, I felt a cold go down my spine. With my head swirling in astonishment, I wanted to flee, but I was unable to move from where I was standing. In the process of turning towards me, Ilara's eyes met mine. The look in her eyes was penetrating, and it was filled with a combination of melancholy and yearning. It seemed as if she was about to speak, but she did not produce any sound. Following that, she disappeared into the mist in the same instant that she had emerged. My grandmother's account was never anything I questioned again. Widow's Hill is still haunted by Ilara's spirit, which serves as a haunting reminder of a love that was lost and a life that was brutally cut short. As she stands in the merciless depths of the ocean, she is a beacon of hopelessness, endlessly seeking for her spouse who has gone missing. The 17th story. The Blackwood Forest, which was located in the middle of Maine and was a vast area of old woods, was a site that was both beautiful and mysterious in its mysteriousness. The people who lived in the area told stories of a malicious monster that lived inside the forest. This creature of shadow and darkness was said to feed on anyone who had the audacity to travel too far into its territory. My good buddy Valerius, who is an avid outdoorsman and enthusiast for hiking, shared with me a tale about Blackwood Forest that made me feel shivers all the way down my spine. According to him, Valerius had been out doing some trekking in Blackwood Forest on a particular fall day, taking pleasure in the fresh air and the vivid colors of the leaves that were changing. He had deviated from the pathways that were indicated, and he found himself deep inside the forest, surrounded by towering pines and old oaks. He had been pulled by the appeal of the unknown. As the sun began to fall, he began to get a peculiar sense of worry about himself. The temperature plummeted by a significant amount, and there was a definite feeling of dread prevalent in the air. It felt as if the forest was becoming darker, the shadows were getting deeper, and the trees were taking on terrible forms. His ears picked up on weird sounds in the distance, including the rustling of leaves, the breaking of twigs, and the guttural growls that appeared to reverberate through the trees themselves. He made an attempt to justify it by blaming it on the wind and the animals that were around. He was aware, however, that something was not quite right. Some entity was keeping an eye on him. It seemed as if the forest was shifting and changing around him as he turned to go. The routes that he had walked vanished, and the trees were closing in on him, enfolding him in their gloomy grip. Not only was he bewildered and lost, but his heart was beating in his chest. He struggled into the woodland, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he searched for a route out of the forest with intense determination. And that is when he discovered it. There was a pair of crimson eyes that were shining and looking at him from the darkness. He felt chills go down his spine as he looked at them because they were enormous, bright, and filled with an old hatred. Although he was unable to make out the shape of the monster, he was able to sense its presence, which was a terrible force that appeared to have the effect of draining the very life from the air around him. He let out a scream and turned to flee, his thoughts racing with fear as he did so. His pulse was hammering in his chest as he rushed blindly into the forest, and the sound of his own frantic breathing reverberated through the trees. His back was being burned by the brilliant red eyes of the thing, and he could sense its presence behind him. The creature's malicious energy was following him. Up until the point when he stumbled out of the woodland and onto a gravel road, which was many miles away from where he had entered, he did not stop running. As the memories of Blackwood Forest was too horrific for him to remember, he never went back there again. The malicious monster of Blackwood Forest is still a mystery. It is a creature of shadow and darkness that prowls throughout the old forest, preying on those who have the audacity to encroach on its territory. The 18th story. A hidden inlet along the rough coastline of California Shipwreck Cove was a site of eerie beauty and terrible history. It was a spot along the coast of California. On the craggy rocks that guarded the entrance to the bay, a great number of ships had met their demise, and their crews had been lost to the harsh sea. The locals told stories of phantom sailors that haunted the cove, their spirit forms constantly looking for their ships that had gone missing and the way back home. A tale about Shipwreck Cove that was related to me by my buddy Zephyr, who is a marine scientist who studies the coastal ecosystems of California, sent shivers down my spine. According to him, Zephyr had been doing research at Shipwreck Cove on a cloudy evening. He had been collecting samples and recording the marine life that flourished in the protected waters. A heavy fog began to come in as the sun began to set, which resulted in the cove being enveloped in a spooky calm. It was just as he was getting ready to go when he heard it. A snippet of song that was born on the breeze. As it reverberated through the mist, it sounded like a sea shanty, which is a sorrowful and haunting song. All around him he gazed, but he saw nothing. A rationalization attempt was made by him, and he blamed it on the wind and the waves. He was aware, however, that something was not quite right. The singing became audible and more intimate. After that, he discovered them. From the depths of the cove, spectral beings appeared, their bodies swirling in the fog, obscuring their appearance. Their features were pale and haggard, and their eyes were empty and filled with misery. They were clothed in torn sailors' attire, despite their appearance. They were singing, their voices wistful and eerie, a lament for their lives that had been taken and the ships that they had lost. Zephyr was unable to move because of his anxiety, and his head was spinning with astonishment. It seemed as if the ghost's seamen were moving towards him, as their ghostly shapes moved through his vessel as if he were not even there. They continued to sing, their voices becoming more louder and more forceful until they filled the air with their wistful cries, which filled the whole room. Thereafter, in the same instant that they had materialized, they disappeared into the mist, their song becoming indistinguishable from the roar of the waves. While his heart was hammering in his chest, Zephyr made his escape from Shipwreck Cove. It was too terrible for him to revisit the memories of the cove, so he never went back there. The haunting sailors of Shipwreck Cove continue to be a mystery. They are spectral reminders of the tragedies that have transpired in those seas and the lost souls that continue to roam the misty shoreline. The 19th story. The ancient mill, which was located in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, was a site of fading beauty and mysteries that were whispered to those who were close to it. The mill itself was a beautiful edifice made of worn stone and aged lumber. It stood alone and intimidating, with its water wheel having been stopped for a considerable amount of time and its grinding stones being coated in dust and cobwebs. Those who lived in the area murmured about the terrible history of the mill, specifically about a young lady called Seraphina who had perished in the mill pond, her soul being permanently ensnared inside the murky depths of the mill pond. They referred to her as the Weeping Woman because her wistful cries could be heard across the valley on nights when there was no moon. The narrative of Seraphina was related to me by my grandmother, Ilara, who grew up close to the old mill. Her voice was quiet with respect and horror as she told me their story. The miller's daughter, she added, was a stunning young lady with long flowing black hair and piercing blue eyes. Seraphina was a gorgeous young woman. In spite of the fact that her father had made a commitment to another person, she had fallen in love with a young guy from a nearby town. This love was banned by her father. One evening, Seraphina and her boyfriend met in a covert meeting by the mill pond. Both of their hearts were filled with an intense need for one another. During the moment when they were embracing, Seraphina's father came upon them, and his anger consumed him. As a result of the battle that occurred, Seraphina fell into the mill pond in an effort to escape her father's fury. Her calls for assistance were drowned by the murky waters of the pond. Despite the fact that her corpse was never found, her soul remained permanently confined to the location where she met her awful end. I was told by my grandma that she had personally saw the spirit of Seraphina. On a misty evening, she was going close to the mill pond when she heard a faint sobbing coming from the direction of the mill. She stated that she became aware of the sound. Despite the fact that her pulse was hammering in her chest, she approached with caution and looked through the mist. At that moment, she was able to see her. At the edge of the mill pond, there was a person dressed in a long white garment, with her hair hanging about her like a shroud.